Wealthy New York socialite and philanthropist Brooke Astor passes away at the age of 105.
Brooke Astor was sort of known unofficially as the queen of New York society and of the queen of New York philanthropy.
But the socialite's last years weren't always easy.
One of the nurses described Mrs. Astor being dragged down the hall against her will, banging on her cane, saying, "I don't want to do this."
Less than 24 hours after Brooke's death, a bitter legal dispute over her $200 million estate rocks the upper crust of New York society.
It was a larger-than-life court case, something that seemed right out of the movies.
And forever damage an already fragile family.
Brooke Astor loved rewriting her will. It was a great pastime for her. She would change her mind all the time.
Brooke Astor, the unofficial First Lady of New York City, passes away at her weekend estate at the age of 105. The death of this beloved benefactor leaves a huge void in New York. During her lifetime, she donated close to $195 million to the likes of the New York City Library, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Carnegie Hall, and the Bronx Zoo.
She was famous for going to some of the scarier neighborhoods in New York at that point in her chauffeured limousine, wearing her Chanel suits and her pearls and her hats. And she always said, people want to see Mrs. Astor. They don't want to see someone schlepping around in slacks. So she was really a treasured visitor all over the city.
When she dies, Brooke's only child, Tony, is not there. Instead, he's told over the phone.
Tony Marshall did not get there quite in time. He got there a little bit later.
As Tony and his wife Charlene grieve over his mother's death, they brace themselves for the inevitable battle over her $200 million estate. In fact, it's already begun. The fight for Brooke's money starts a year before she dies. 2006, Northeast Harbor, Maine. Tony and Charlene are vacationing at Cove End, Brooke Astor's former summer home. One morning, Tony receives a surprise phone call. It's his mother's doctor. He tells him that Brooke is in the hospital with pneumonia.
I was there a whole weekend, and I can assure you that there was really nothing concerning about her health condition.
Then the phone rings a second time. This time it's Tony's son, Philip. They haven't spoken in a year.
He had developed a distant relationship with his father. They saw each other occasionally.
The phone call is not an easy one for Philip to make. It's about his grandmother, Brooke. Philip tells Tony that he has filed a guardianship petition against him to seize control over Brooke's care and fortune.
A guardianship proceeding is a proceeding to appoint a guardian for someone who no longer has the ability to take care of themselves.
Philip thinks his father, who is now in his 80s, can no longer take care of Brooke.
He wanted to make sure that his grandmother is taken care of. I don't think he trusted Tony Marshall to take care of his mother.
Tony is shocked by his son's betrayal. Philip didn't even warn him before the petition was filed. Tony is responsible for taking care of his 104-year-old mother and has been for the last 4 years, while Philip only sees his grandmother a few times a year.
When Mr. Marshall finds out that it's a petition against him, he was very concerned.
He and Charlene were both, by all accounts, surprised, distraught, horrified. Tony had a very formal relationship with his twin sons. They both said that he was not a very physically affectionate, a lot of hugs and kisses, more of manly handshakes.
While the accusation that Tony is neglecting his mother seems to come out of the blue, in Philip's eyes it's been brewing for a while. Philip first becomes concerned about Brooke during a simple visit to Grandma's house just 7 months earlier. January 2006, Philip Marshall is 53 years old and is a professor of historic preservation at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island, but he has been making regular visits to his grandmother since his own college days.
Philip Marshall, who's very much a kind of down-to-earth guy, would describe these hilarious vacations of going to Europe and his grandmother taking him to shop at fancy stores, which he thought was quite absurd. Private ski lessons. When he went to Brown University, Brooke Astor used to visit her friends in Newport nearby, so they really began to become close. And Philip was very interested in historic preservation, which was something, and museums and art, and that was something his grandmother cared about. So over the years, they did become close over those subjects.
In 2006, he pays a visit to his grandmother in New York. At 104 years old, Brooke is not the energetic woman she used to be.
Mentally, she was declining, and also physically. She was over 100 years old, and she had had 2 hip surgeries, and she was frail. She weighed less than 100 pounds, but sometimes she was cheery.
During Philip's visit with Brooke, he sits with her and sings to her until she falls asleep. As he is about to leave, he stops to chat with 2 of Brooke's nurses.
He happened to turn up at a time of shift change for the nurses, and Mrs. Astor fell asleep. And suddenly, the nurses really unloaded on Philip about things they were unhappy with the apartment. They felt that there were certain, the house wasn't being cleaned. There were, parts of the apartment that were shabby. They really kind of unleashed a storm.
They also tell Philip that Brooke has only been going to the doctor once a month, is never taken outside, and she is being served questionable food. It's mostly hearsay, but Philip takes their concerns seriously.
He lived in a different state, and although he came to visit, he was not involved in the day-to-day activities of his grandmother.
He thinks that his father is either blind to what is happening or is ignoring it.
I don't think that Philip thought that his father meant to hurt the grandmother. I just think that he didn't think that he's capable of taking care of her. He's an older gentleman himself.
Unsure of what to do next, he contacts Brooke's former butler and friend, Chris Ely.
Philip called Chris, and Chris met with him, and they began to talk about all the things that were going on.
Philip tries to find out if Brooke is being mistreated. He visits her Park Avenue apartment and sees that the carpet is stained and that some of the paint is peeling. Next, Philip contacts some of Brooke's other staff members who also share stories of neglect.
He also talked to people being on the duty at the time, and which was really kind of maybe weird to me at the time. But when he was leaving, he says, well, please don't let my father, I was here.
Then he speaks to Alice Perdue, Brooke's former office manager. Alice tells Philip she noticed some questionable financial dealings, in particular that Tony had her write out checks for nearly $1 million to fund somewhat dubious investments.
Alice Perdue was working at the Vincent Astor Foundation, and she was in charge of the checkbook. And Mrs. Astor had dementia, and her son was asking her to cut checks to himself and also to Broadway plays that he was investing in with his wife, Charlene.
This seems unusual because Brooke has previously only given minimal grants to the performing arts.
So the lady who's cutting the checks knows that this can't be right, and she knew that this was wrong. So when she was questioned about it, that led to further allegations of misappropriation of her funds.
Philip also learns that his father had cut back Brooke's expenses, while at the same time spending her money on things for himself, like employing a full-time captain for his new yacht. Upset, Philip turns to his brother Alec, but he tells Philip that he doesn't want to get involved. Instead, Philip asks Brooke's closest friends for their support in his battle for his grandmother.
Miss Astor's friends, Anna De Laurenta, Henry Kissinger, and David Rockefeller, among them, and I'm sure some other friends as well, felt that she'll be better off with an independent guardian.
So they all went ahead and they filed a guardianship case that hit in July of 2006.
The petition will pit son against father and set New York society ablaze with the rumor that one of the wealthiest women in the city is living in squalor.
The language in the lawsuit was pretty over the top, talking about elder abuse and a urine-stained couch.
Brooke Astor, known as the Grand Dame of New York, passes away at the age of 105. She leaves behind an estate worth millions. But Brooke wasn't born in the world of high society. She had to climb her way to the top. Brooke Astor is born at the beginning of the 20th century as the only child to John and Mabel Russell.
Her father was the head of the Marine Corps at one point, and so as a child she was always traveling. She'd had a comfortable upbringing, no big money by any means, but comfortable.
In her autobiography, Footprints, Brooke writes about her childhood in China and how her mother forced her to drop out of high school to find a good husband. At 16 years old, Brooke meets New Jersey heir Dryden Cooser. They marry in 1919, just days after her 17th birthday.
Dryden Cooser was from a very wealthy New Jersey family. He really courted Brooke Astor, and her mother really encouraged her to marry him.
Dryden is a perfect match on paper, but behind the scenes, things are not so wonderful.
Over the years, Dryden Cooser turned out to be an alcoholic, a womanizer, and sadly also a wife-beater.
Brooke also wrote that when she becomes pregnant 4 years later, it's against her will.
Brooke wrote that it was not her choice when she conceived her only child, Tony, and that when she was 6 months pregnant, her husband broke her jaw.
Their son Anthony is born in 1924. Brooke loves Tony, but he is a constant reminder of her unhappy marriage.
She had a very complex relationship with her son, Tony. First of all, he was the son of her hated first husband. So that must have created a difficult dynamic from the beginning.
They divorce in 1929, and as part of their divorce settlement, Brooke receives a $90,000 annual trust fund, equivalent to over $1 million today. There's one stipulation. If she remarries, it gets handed over to Tony. Brooke doesn't enjoy her ex-husband's money for long. 3 years later, she remarries in 1932.
She married a man called Buddy Marshall, who she said was the love of her life. And because her son adored him, he asked if he could take his stepfather's name, and that's what happened. That's why he's known as Tony Marshall.
While Brooke is finally happy in her second marriage, she and her husband have money problems, and they turn to 24-year-old Tony for help.
Buddy was successful, but he wasn't enormously successful as a stockbroker. So there were times when Brooke Astor would lean on her son.
Thanks to the trust fund that once belonged to his mother, Tony gives Brooke a monthly allowance.
Brooke Astor would later say that she didn't feel like she took care of herself in her divorce from her first husband because money she thought should have gone to her went to her son instead. So she felt to some extent entitled to it.
Brooke and Buddy's marriage comes to an end in 1952 when Buddy dies of a heart attack.
She was totally devastated, and she also discovered that essentially she was not going to have a lot of money left to live on because during Buddy Marshall's divorce, most of the money was promised to his first family and children. So she went into a bit of a panic that she wasn't going to have the life that she had expected.
Until she meets Vincent Astor. Vincent is one of the richest men in America.
I think it was something like only 6 months later that she was invited to a dinner party and sat across the table from Vincent Astor. It was very difficult, famously difficult.
5 months later, they marry on October 8, 1953. While he's besotted with his new wife, Vincent doesn't like the 29-year-old Tony.
Vincent Astor was not particularly fond of his new stepson. And as Brooke wrote in one of her books, he really discouraged her from seeing him and spending time with him. And therefore, she guiltily cut back on her relationship with her son.
But again, the marriage is short-lived. Vincent dies on February 3, 1959, at the age of 67. But this husband leaves behind an estate worth $127 million and gives almost all of it to Brooke.
When he died, only 5 years and 3 months after their marriage, he died, and left her this extraordinary gift, a $60 million trust, $2 million in cash.
But Vincent's half-brother Jack is upset. He feels that he should inherit some of Vincent's millions. This is Brooke's first battle over money, but not her last. Jack sues Brooke for half her share, insisting Vincent was influenced by alcohol when he signed his last will during a hospital stay. Brooke fights back, saying that her late husband knew what he was doing.
Eventually, she admitted during the trial that she had actually brought alcohol to Vincent Astor's room because he asked her for it.
But before a jury can be picked, Jack settles for $250,000, and Brooke's new life as the widow Astor begins. Along with a personal fortune, Brooke has also left her late husband's Philanthropic Astor Foundation to run.
She used to like to say that it was the greatest gift anyone could have given her, because it gave her the opportunity to, with tremendous judgment and in a very discerning way, give away money in New York City.
To that end, she holds exclusive parties with a mix of accomplished, interesting, and colorful guests.
During the late 70s, through the 80s, and really through the 90s, one of the most sought-after invitations in New York was to a party at the apartment of Brooke Astor on Park Avenue. You would walk in and there would be the Kissingers, Mrs. Onassis, Nancy Reagan, if she was in town, and also great poets and playwrights and politicians.
She included Tony Marshall in, many of her events, but not all of them. Brooke would complain that he was boring. The worst sin in her book was being boring.
Tony and his mother are not close.
He didn't have the relationship with his mother that he would have liked. He really wanted a different kind of relationship. He wanted to be closer.
As a child, Tony is shipped off to boarding school or sent to his grandparents' house. In 1942, a few months before he graduates from high school, Tony enlists in the Marines. World War II is raging, and Tony serves 4 years of active duty.
Tony was wounded at Iwo Jima, received a Purple Heart, and after the war ended, he joined what was then the beginning of the CIA and traveled extensively around the world. He married for the first time his sweetheart at Brown University, and they had twins, Philip and Alex.
Tony divorces his first wife in 1962, and just a year later he marries his secretary, Thelma Hognell. He rarely sees his sons, Philip and Alec.
After Tony Marshall's divorce, his ex-wife Liz moved away from New York with the children. They moved up to Massachusetts, they moved up to Vermont.
7 years later, Tony, now 45, becomes the U.S. ambassador to the Malagasy Republic.
His mother gave a significant sum of money to Richard Nixon, which is at that point how people often got ambassadorships. And Tony was sent off to a series. He was in Madagascar, he was in Trinidad and Tobago, and then he was in Kenya. And apparently did a very good job during that period. But when Jimmy Carter won election and the Republicans were out, then Tony found himself job hunting.
Brooke offers him a position managing her money, then complains to friends that her son always needs a helping hand, even though he willingly helped her years before.
It must have been a tremendously daunting thing to have been the son of the great Mrs. Astor, who was so kind of beloved and such a kind of society figure and philanthropic figure. And his whole life, he was really in her shadow.
In 1989, Tony is still married to his second wife, but another woman is about to enter the picture, and she will cause a scandal that some say Brooke never gets over.
She was, horrified that this had happened under her roof.
New York socialite Brooke Astor passes away in 2007. But years before her death, her relationship with her only son Tony was difficult at times. Some think their biggest issue occurred when he chose a wife she didn't agree with. It all starts over lunch in a little town in Maine.
Brooke Astor spent her summers in Northeast Harbor, which is a wonderful small resort in Maine, and resort town in Maine. And Vincent Astor had bought her a house there. They had a house together there. And it was her favorite. She was like the queen of this very tiny town with no stoplights.
Like in New York, Brooke Astor holds gatherings at her home, Cove End. Today, her guests include the local pastor Paul Gilbert and his wife, Charlene.
Tony was in the habit of visiting his mother without his wife. And he went up one weekend. Mrs. Astor gave a lunch for Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post. And she put Paul Gilbert at the head table with herself and Mrs. Graham, and she seated Tony and Charlene in what might be called Siberia at a different table, and they fell in love at lunch. They were then both married. Soon the staff began to describe seeing, Charlene Gilbert coming up the front walk at 6:30 in the morning, and Tony Marshall slipping out the door, and then Tony would be gone sometimes for many hours during the day. And it all eventually came to a crunch when Paul Gilbert learned about the affair.
Within months, they both leave their spouses. Charlene and Tony marry in 1992. Brooke is scandalized by their behavior.
Some of the staffers in Maine talked about hearing Brooke Astor, who was horrified. She was, horrified that this had happened under her roof. She really liked Paul Gilbert. She, was really appalled by this, and she had not particularly taken to Charlene Gilbert in the first place, but this particularly kind of sent her off.
Nevertheless, Tony and Charlene stay together, and Brooke even buys the couple a duplex apartment.
Ultimately, she made the decision, as often the parents of, divorced children do, that she wanted to maintain a relationship with her son.
But 5 years later, things between mother and son are still not picture perfect. Manhattan, New York, 1996. Brooke, now 94, announces to the press that she will be closing the Astor Foundation, and the remaining $25 million will be spent within the year. The decision is painful for Tony, who has served on the board of directors for the past 30 years. It was thought that once Brooke retired, he would take over.
Running that kind of a philanthropy in New York is a lot of fun. It's great to give away money. People want to spend time with you. People give you a certain amount of respect. But at the end of the day, she made the decision that she said to the New York Times, my son is not an Astor, and I want to spend down the money and close this thing down. He was sitting right next to her when she made that statement.
Despite this, in January 2002, Brooke is very generous to her son in a new draft of her will.
Brooke Astor loved rewriting her will. It was a great pastime for her. She would change her mind all the time.
In the latest version, Tony is slated to receive several of her valuable properties, $5 million, as well as a yearly sum of $4.2 million for the rest of his life. She leaves her grandsons, Philip and Alec, $1 million each, and she leaves $60 million to various charities.
She always stated throughout her life and in her books about how much she loved Tony. But I think it was a bit of a push-pull relationship in that she felt guilty towards him, she loved him, so she would do very expansive gestures, but then she would withdraw to some extent.
While it is a fantastic inheritance for Tony, it is an insult to his wife, Charlene.
Mrs. Astor really came to dislike her daughter-in-law, Charlene. So she wrote her will in such a way that Tony had heart problems. He had a series of heart attacks. So Mrs. Astor wrote a will that if her son died before she did, all of that money, the apartments, the trust, were all going to go to charity. And Charlene was going to receive a snowflake diamond necklace and matching earrings, and 2 of Mrs. Astor's used fur coats.
Tony's heart problems aside, it is Brooke's health that declines, forcing Tony to run his mother's household.
Once Tony and Charlene began taking over paying Mrs. Astor's bills and her affairs, they understandably became concerned about the expenses. She had always lived exceptionally well. She had huge staffs in both, Maine, Holly Hill, and in New York, and they began to look at ways to cut costs.
Tony closes down Holly Hill, her weekend house, and also lays off several of her longtime staff members, like her chauffeur, office manager, gardeners, and her beloved butler, Christopher Ely.
Famously, in her later years, she had this English butler who worked for her called Christopher Ely, and he went to work for her in 1997. She adored him, and he was very, very devoted to her. So it was a lovely relationship.
It was a huge, loss in her life, and Mrs. Astor was convinced that he had been dead because she couldn't think of any other reason why he would leave her.
This was obviously a completely devastating thing for him. He cared for her deeply, and he was very concerned, so he stayed in touch on the telephone with her nurses and her staff to make sure that she was okay. But he grew very, very concerned about the way that she was being treated.
The butler, I think he was sort of confused as his role. I think he forgot sometimes he was an employee and not a relative. And I think that caused some of the problems.
Despite these changes, Tony's relationship with his mother couldn't be better.
He came to visit Mrs. Astor sometimes 3 times a week, usually on Sundays after church. Oh, Mr. Marshall would kiss her on her forehead every time and say, "I love you, Mother." And she would take his hand and kiss him. She didn't say much, but she'd look at him and just kiss his hand.
And his career takes off in a new turn. Tony and Charlene become Broadway producers, and successful ones at that. Their 2003 show Long Day's Journey into Night wins the Tony Award for Best Revival of a Play. And in 2004, I Am My Own Wife wins for Best Play.
They were considered to be kind of innovative and creative. People who work with them, directors, actors, artists, really speak very, very highly of them.
During this time, Tony's future becomes even more financially secure thanks to 3 new updates to Brooke's will. Tony now stands to inherit $60 million outright, money that previously had been set aside for charity. The will also gives him the power to make Charlene one of his executors. Everything finally seems to be going well. Until Philip, Annette de la Renta, David Rockefeller, and Henry Kissinger filed the guardianship petition. They charged Tony with significantly eroding his mother's quality of life.
The language in the lawsuit was pretty over the top, talking about elder abuse and a urine-stained couch, and essentially asked that both physical guardianship of Brooke Astor and also her finances be taken away.
It is assumed the case will be kept private, but the file gets accidentally left on the public record, and 2 days later, a New York paper breaks the story.
I think the headline was "Disaster for Mrs. Astor." And so it was full of these allegations that Mrs. Astor was being mistreated by her son. There were allegations that she was being denied medications that she needed.
I read a lot in the paper and I was dismayed and shocked at some of the allegations and some of the blame that was placed on her only son. And I did not believe a lot of it. I think some of it was fabrication and a lot of exaggeration of the truth.
Tony releases a statement. He says he is shocked and deeply hurt and calls the accusations outright lies.
People were saying unkind things. The people were being very disrespectful. And I was told they were going for the jugular. I couldn't understand why.
The damage to Tony's image was done the minute the guardianship was filed. And New York was split. There were a lot of people who remained loyal to Tony and felt that he had been a good son to his mother. And there were other people who were appalled.
Almost immediately after the guardianship petition is filed, and without giving Tony a chance to defend himself, the judge cuts off Tony's salary, bans him from his office, and names new temporary guardians for Brooke.
It was probably found to be safer and fairer to all of the parties if we just freeze Tony's access and his basically absolute power over the estate to protect everything. And then later on, when Tony has time to mount his defense, any harm that's been done by the order can be undone, can be rectified.
Annette De La Renta was appointed as the guardian for personal needs, and J.P. Morgan Chase was appointed as Miss Astor's guardian for her finances.
Annette De La Renta promptly moves Brooke from Manhattan to her beloved weekend estate Holly Hill in upstate New York.
Mrs. De La Renta knew how much Mrs. Astor loved her butler, Gracili, so she rehired him.
Meanwhile, the petition also briefly looks into Brooke's finances. In September, the New York Times runs an article saying J.P. Morgan Chase is investigating whether Tony improperly obtained about $14 million in cash, property, and stocks from his mother while managing her finances.
J.P. Morgan Chase has found account transfers from Miss Astor's accounts to Tony Marshall's personal accounts, or have found money going to Tony Marshall's projects, such as Broadway plays.
There's a number of justifications that could exist in this case. His amount of work for the estates had greatly increased, his visibility, his prominence. He was basically replacing Brooke Astor, which are very large shoes to fill.
Over the next 6 months, Tony and Charlene cut off all ties with his son, Philip. And when Tony finds out that his other son, Alec, didn't warn him about the petition, he stops talking to him, too. Tony and Charlene try to maintain a regular lifestyle, but they are harassed by paparazzi.
Tony and Charlene became the villains in the New York tabloid press. The New York Post ran a headline going, "Evil son visits Astor in the hospital."
And things are about to take a very dark turn.
They got hate mail, they got middle-of-the-night phone calls, their apartment was staked out.
Brooke Astor dies in 2007. But in 2006, her son Tony Marshall's rights to her millions is in question after his son Philip initiates a legal battle to seize control of Brooke's care and finances. Tony and his wife Charlene maintain their innocence, but they're viewed as villains in the eyes of the press.
They really never had a chance to put forward their point of view, and kind of everything they did, they were shadowed by the press everywhere they went. They got hate mail, they got middle-of-the-night phone calls, their apartment was staked out.
By October, Tony wants his life to return to normal, so he settles the dispute. He agrees to give up his role as steward of his mom's financial and health affairs, as well as his large salary. Tony and Charlene are ordered to return $11 million worth of jewelry, art, and cash. The couple defend themselves by stating that the items were bequeathed to them in Brooke's will. In exchange, the settlement is to state that Tony and Charlene admit to no wrongdoing.
The reason why Mr. Marshall settled this case and didn't go to trial was, I think, that he probably just wanted to put all of this behind him and just go on with his life.
J.P. Morgan Chase and Annette De La Renta become Brooke's permanent guardians.
One of the really touching things about that, Mrs. Astor was really not speaking very much, and she had really kind of retreated into herself. But she began to eat again. She gained 15 pounds within the first couple of months.
Just 2 months later, however, Tony is vindicated when the state Supreme Court rules that the claims of elder abuse cannot be substantiated.
Even though Tony Marshall was found to be in essence, innocent of elder abuse. The charges were unsubstantiated. The interim or temporary measures, which were originally ordered by the court, were continued.
Tony may have lost his salary in the settlement, but once his mother passes away, he's still in line to inherit the majority of Brooke's $200 million estate, according to her 2002 will. But Susan Robbins, Brooke's court-appointed lawyer, has been taking a closer look at the will and the codicils, or amendments to it. She notices that one of Brooke's signatures is steadier than the others and hires a forensic handwriting expert to examine the documents. Just a week after Tony and Charlene celebrate their legal victory, the handwriting expert drops a bombshell. Brooke's signature on the third codicil of her 2002 will is a fake. The case is turned over to the authorities. The first change to the 2002 will is made in December 2003. Brooke Astor is 101 years old and is under the constant care of nurses in her Park Avenue apartment because of her deteriorating health. Every day they take detailed notes on her condition.
Most nurses keep notes about, your temperature, your fever, the medications. They wrote about everything. They wrote about Mrs. Astor's dreams, her nightmares. They wrote about her visitors. They wrote down conversations.
On December 17th, they write that she is experiencing moments of paranoia using undecipherable words and appears disoriented and incoherent. Even so, the next day she meets with Tony and her longtime lawyer, Terry Christensen, to change her will.
Tony really badgered Mrs. Astor's lawyer, and ultimately there was a new codicil written in which Tony was going to set up the Tony Marshall Fund with some of his mother's money, which would have allowed him to give money to charity.
It's not unimaginable that she would choose to do this. It actually kind of makes sense that Tony would continue her legacy, but through him.
Henry, also known as Terry Christensen, had put in a note saying first and final codicil. And the interpretation was that he was trying to tell Tony, I'm making this last change, but no more.
And less than a month later, Tony pushes Brooke's lawyer aside. He brings in a new estate planning lawyer, a friend named Francis Morrissey.
He would often be the escort for Brooke Astor in attending Tony Marshall's plays. They would include him in dinners and various events.
When Tony Marshall hires Francis Morrissey Jr., from his point of view, he's hiring somebody whom he trusts, somebody who's a close friend, somebody who has a lot of experience in dealing with these sort of estates.
Right away, they make more changes to Brooke's will. A second codicil signs over $60 million directly to Tony, instead of it going to charity, and gives Tony the power to name Charlene and Morrissey as executors. Their fees for handling Brooke's estate would be $4.89 million. And just a few weeks later, a third codicil is signed.
Suddenly, Mrs. Astor is signing a second and a third codicil, which really changes her will and gives a lot of the money that was going to go to charity to her son, Tony Marshall.
It seemed highly improbable, having had fought for these charitable institutions for so passionately for so long, that suddenly she would be giving up control of that money to her son.
There's a number of possible justifications for Tony to inherit such a large sum in that second codicil. First of all, he is her one and only son, and they had been together for all 80 years of his life. Even when he was younger, there was a point during Brooke Astor's second marriage where Tony was supporting her and her second husband.
As the investigation continues, Brooke Astor is 104 years old and is barely holding on.
I kind of knew that Mrs. Astor's health condition it's getting weaker, and it's really getting more serious after she'd been moved away to the country house.
A second fight over her estate is brewing, and it will prompt a criminal battle that will shock the upper crust of New York society. And the question on everyone's mind is, did Tony take advantage of his mother's declining health to get a hold of her millions?
No mother really wants to see her son sent to jail.
In 2007, New York philanthropist Brooke Astor turns 105 years old. A year earlier, her grandson Philip launched a legal battle over her care, and now a second battle is looming. Brooke Astor's time is running out. She is more and more fragile and is losing the ability to speak in full sentences.
I think she suspected, she sensed what was going on. She knew something wasn't right. That's what I think.
Though others paint a calmer picture of her last year.
It was a good year for her, to the extent at that age you can have a good year, but she had people visit, she had familiar faces around. Her local pastor came to visit, and he said that she seemed alert and able to at least understand. She made the sign of the cross. So there was a feeling of that year of peace for her.
She dies in August 2007. Upon her death, two things happen. First, Brooke's guardians, Annette De La Renta and J.P. Morgan Chase, launch a legal challenge to her will. And second, the Manhattan District Attorney Office launches a criminal trial against Tony and his lawyer Francis Morrissey for fraud. In November, they're ordered to turn themselves in to the authorities. They have finished their investigations into Brooke's will, and they're ready to proceed. The 18-count indictment includes grand larceny, falsifying business records, conspiracy, forgery, and possession of stolen property, among others.
Tony was confident that he would beat these criminal charges because he was very confident of his primary defense, that these were fully his mother's intentions, that she loved him, that she wanted to help him, that she wanted to benefit him, that she was fully aware of what she was doing.
Less than 2 years later, the trial begins. The prosecution begins with a smoking gun, a 7-page letter Tony wrote to Brooke's physician. The letter proves that Tony knew Brooke was diagnosed with a debilitating disease, Alzheimer's, in 2000.
There came a point when Brooke Astor, who had been tremendously independent, suddenly began to slip, and she was forgetful. Tony took his mother to a neurologist who diagnosed her with Alzheimer's. Tony wrote a letter to the doctor afterwards saying that he was really relieved to hear that there were diagnoses, because he described, a lot of sort of strange and unhappy and hostile behavior and ways in which she couldn't do numbers, she couldn't do arithmetic.
Tony keeps the diagnosis private, telling only his wife Charlene, his sons Philip and Alec, butler Chris Ely, and her lawyer Terry Christensen. Despite knowing about her condition, Tony still encourages her to make changes to her 2002 will that will benefit him. And the prosecution can prove it now. Brooke's will was revised 4 times after the letter was written.
That letter was central to the trial because a lot of the changes Mrs. Astor made in her will came after that. There's no legal prohibition against someone making changes in their will up till they die, and whether they've been diagnosed with, because they can certainly have good days and bad days. But the prosecutors pointed to that letter as Tony's awareness that his mother was not in her right mind.
Prosecutors argue Tony took advantage of his mother's deteriorating mind for his wife's sake.
At his trial, the prosecutor got up in opening arguments and basically said that the motive for Tony Marshall's crime was Charlene. This was all about trying to take care of his wife, and that he became increasingly concerned about trying to get his mother to give him money sooner, to change her will, to do a variety of things. At his trial, the prosecutor got up in opening arguments and basically said that the motive for Tony Marshall's crime was Charlene.
Many of Brooke's friends and staff take the stand.
The trial was a parade of a who's who of New York testifying for the prosecution.
Well, it was rather gripping to follow that trial. It was covered by the New York Times, the New York Post, the Daily News, all of the and national newspapers, and it was just it was a larger-than-life court case, something that seemed right out of the movies.
One of the nurses described Mrs. Astor being dragged down the hall against her will, banging on her cane, saying, "I don't want to do this." before she signed one of the codicils to the will.
A drastic change is not out of the question. It could have been that in that age, at 101, 2, 3, 4 years old, maybe that's when, seeing the end coming, Brooke Astor finally realizes, you know what? Maybe I've neglected this one son that I have who stood by me all of these years.
Philip only attends the trial once to testify against his father.
Philip Marshall had to make these allegations about his father with his father sitting right there. It must have been very painful and torturous, and he must have believed in it very profoundly to go to the extent of announcing his father and his stepmother, Charlene.
Tony never takes the stand to defend himself, but his team insists Brooke knowingly altered her will to benefit her only child. She wrote 31 versions of her will in her lifetime.
It seemed that Tony was counting on his many years. We're talking about decades and decades of fulfilling the role of a dutiful son, of loyalty to his mother, of supporting her in her endeavors and being present for her. He really felt that this would speak loudly for him because it's very contrary to the allegations that were being made against him, that he would suddenly turn and begin to take advantage of her when he had been, again, so loyal for such a long time.
But these accounts are not enough to convince the jury.
Tony was convicted of grand larceny and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in jail.
I was very sad that Mrs. Astor's only son was being treated like a criminal, which he wasn't. Because I believe he loved his mother and his mother loved him.
Whatever he's done, if he doesn't stand a chance of surviving prison. But immediately his lawyers announced that he was going to appeal the verdict.
The jury comes down equally hard on Francis Morrissey. He is convicted of forging Brooke's signature, as well as fraud and conspiracy. He also receives a sentence of 1 to 3 years in prison. Both Francis and Tony appeal their verdicts, though it could take years before their names are cleared. In the meantime, they are permitted to remain free on bail.
If she had been aware of it, I'm sure that she would have been horrified. Whatever feelings she may have had about her daughter-in-law, whatever complex feelings she may have had about her son and perhaps his desire to get hold of her assets, no mother really wants to see her son sent to jail.
While Philip hopes his father doesn't end up in jail, he believes filing the guardianship petition was the right thing to do for his grandmother.
Well, it seemed like this very bizarre, almost sort of Oedipal conflict of son against father trying to protect grandmother.
Tony and his son still haven't reconciled.
It has wrecked his life, and he's now not on speaking terms with his son Philip, and apparently not speaking to his other son, Alec.
It takes 3 legal proceedings and 3 years to sort out Brooke's estate. Eventually, it is decided that Brooke Astor's will should be based on the 2002 version, before the 2004 amendments.
She was still with her previous lawyer from Sullivan and Cromwell, so there was really no reason to believe that there was an issue with the 2002 will and its codicil. That's why it was agreed by everyone that that will should be admitted to probate.
This still leaves Tony with $14.5 million.
If Tony Marshall had simply waited for his mother to die and none of the legal shenanigans had taken place, he would be a very wealthy man today. But because of running up $14 million in legal fees, he did not end up getting a lot of money from his mother's estate.
$30 million will go toward creating the Brooke Astor Fund for New York City education, and millions more will go to Prospect Park, Central Park, city playgrounds, and various cultural institutions.
And at the end, most of her money is going to her favorite charities, which was what she wanted, clearly, from her wills.
Meanwhile, Tony is still waiting for the appeal which will determine how he will spend the rest of his life.
It's a hell of a way to wind up being 88 years old, having been publicly humiliated and vilified, being married to a woman who supported him, who has been publicly vilified. It's a pretty grim way to spend the final years of your life.
Brooke's friends hope that the legal drama will not tarnish all the good work she did while she was alive.
Can't help but think that she would have been sad that her legacy had become this instead of, her years of presiding over New York. But whenever you see a picture of Brooke Astor, she's usually smiling, and there really is something that there was such joy in her life and such pleasure, so you hope that some of those feelings will linger on.